Obviously, obesity and its costs affect interstate commerce. Does Congress have the constitutional power to require obese people to sign up for Weight Watchers? If not, why not?
Well, Justice Vinson's opinion about Obamacare, saying that the government can't regulate inactivity and that we're stretching the Commerce Clause too far. I mean, I think it's kind of silly. Everything having to do with health care does cross state boundaries. Even that notion of the Commerce Clause as regulating among the states is a kind of antiquarian idea. The government can ask you to do things. It asks us
It's not asking us, it's mandating.
Well, but it asks us to pay our taxes. It asks us to register for the draft. It asks us to buy car insurance if we want to drive our car around. And the question is, if something is unconstitutional, people out there tend to think like some alarm bell will go off if something is unconstitutional. It's unconstitutional if the Supreme Court decides that it's unconstitutional. And by the way, this can go to the Supreme Court, and we can see whether that happens.
Well, does Congress have the power to mandate that obese people sign up for? Do they have the power to do this?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that.
You don't know.
Well, and the beauty of that is the not knowing, and given we could predict that Rick would say that because he's saying that's the color of the curtain, the basic foundation is set.
Is that a yes, Congress does have the power to mandate?
It's open. If they decide that they will have the power to do so.
Can I just offer up a sort of slightly different vantage on this question? Because I think it's an important one. But I mean, I think, again, just want to sound the note again that this debate is what the Constitution is about, right? We can have this debate. This is evidence that the Constitution is working.
Let me just ask also, because obviously so much has changed. It's obvious to say that, but in 200 years, could the framers have ever imagined assault weapons or violent video games or whatever when it was written, not in stone, on parchment? What about, for instance, this very contentious Second Amendment, which is also a hot potato in today's political world? It was for regulated militias, but it was also it was in the time of the musket.
Well, it was. In fact, George Washington, I believe in 1791, signed a bill asking Americans to buy muskets and buy ammunition. I think the Second Amendment is one of those issues where the way it's been interpreted over 200 years affects exactly the way it is now. I don't know that anybody really knows the exact meaning of the Second Amendment in terms of what is absolutely what the clear intent of the framers was. In fact, I would argue that whatever that was, it has been adapted to this new world that we're living in now. So if we're talking about the Second Amendment or we're talking about the War Powers Act, George Washington would not have known what to do about whether drone warfare qualifies as an act of military engagement and therefore it engages the War Powers Act. The War Powers Act itself may be unconstitutional. It has never been tested in the Supreme Court.
In the first decade of the 21st century, that 18th century amendment, Second Amendment, pertaining to bearing arms, was settled in this sense. The Supreme Court finally said, based on extraordinary scholarship on both sides, that it does protect an individual right, not the collective right of militias. The Founding Fathers didn't know anything about telephones, but they did say in the Fourth Amendment that we shall be protected from unreasonable searches and seizures, and the court, applying the values of the framers, applied that to wiretaps, and a whole set of law has evolved around that. So the fact that the framers didn't envision a particular technology by no means disqualifies what they wrote from being applied to modern conditions.
You're here where we are agreeing finally. Because the point is that they couldn't have anticipated things that they didn't know existed. So as a result of that, it's left up to us to interpret what they meant. See, I think that the Constitution is like the Bible, and some Christians' relationship to the Bible. Some people are literalists, so they think every I must be dotted, every T must be crossed, and they believe in the literal interpretation of the word. Some are more liberal and progressive in thinking that this is a suggestion about the moral content of one's identity, that one must not adhere strictly to that. But we, in light of those constitutional values, can interpret them and apply them in ways that I think are edifying, and we have to make arguments about that. We can't assume we know the one-to-one correlation between the Founding Fathers, the Constitution, and what we do today.
I mean, for instance, the First Amendment, the controversial, in some quarters, ruling by the Supreme Court this week regarding violent video games for children. There are many parents who have been sort of outraged about that, and yet it's framed in a basic First Amendment right. Is that an example of something that is obvious, it should be like that, or is that also part of the struggle to figure out how to match 200 years with today?
Well, I think it's important just not to collapse that distance between those 200 years and today, and to understand all the history that's come in between the two. I mean, there's this great, moment in Franklin's writings when he says, if I could be preserved in a vat of Madeira wine and be reawakened in 100 or 200 years, I'd really like to see how this country turns out.
Didn't he also say, and you wrote about this, he was amazingly perspicacious when this Constitution was signed. He stood up and he said, well, I don't know whether it's the best, it might be the best, and because
right. I mean, a lot of these guys were really, very, very conscious of the judgment of posterity. They really thought a lot about how this document would be understood over time. Hence Franklin, who was going to make a joke about it, talking about Madeira wine. But, he did not preserve himself. He's not available for us. But what he did sort of to make sure to put into the record of the proceedings on that last day when the Constitution was signed, he did this quip about this. She stole from someone. Like, there's always stealing his jokes from other people. The only difference between the Church of England and the Church of Rome is that the former is infallible and the latter is never wrong. This was Franklin sort of trying to say, I will change my mind if I were around long enough. I'm at the end of my years here. I would change my mind, and so other people will change their minds, and that is how this document works.
And he said right after that, remember, in that speech, he said, let us all doubt a little of our own infallibility. That is great advice for our politics now, because this discussion of the Constitution that happens between the Tea Party, between progressives, between everybody thinks that they have the God's honest truth about this, that there's absolutely one way of interpreting it. Even Franklin, the founding father, said, let us all doubt a little of our own infallibility. That is what the Constitution is for. When Marshall said it's basically you have to adapt it to the current times, he set that in motion for the rest of our history, and I think we do have to adapt it.
I want to get your final thoughts through the process of asking each of you which is your favorite founding father, who is your favorite founding father, and why.
Well, I'd have to say Madison, because he really was, not because he was the shortest founding father, he was only 5'2", by the way, but he really was the architect of the Constitution. I felt tried to balance the more centralized vision of Hamilton and the more decentralized vision of Jefferson. And because the document ultimately was, and probably is, the greatest product of compromise in human history.
Compromise, that's not a word we hear a lot right now. Jill, your favorite?
Benjamin Franklin's sister Jane, who on July 4th in 1786, the 10th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, thinking back on what the Revolution had accomplished, wrote her brother a letter. She'd been reading Richard Price, the English philosopher, political philosopher, and she said, I think what I've realized is that in this world, there are very few people who are able to break through all the barriers of poverty and ignorance. There are Isaac Newtons all over the world that we'll never hear from. She, I think, represents the great lesson of the promise of the Revolutionary era.
I'd have to say Thomas Jefferson. I mean, in his life, the genius of self-individualized expression, the incredible contribution to the Declaration of Independence, though he didn't want it to be in any way revised. Redactors prevailed. His commitment to the flourishing of democracy despite his own individual flaws. And I think the beauty of his being tethered to Sally Hemings is, at the end of the day, after all the ink and the parchment and the abstract discourse, it's about flesh, it's about engagement, it's about the lived realities. And Sally Hemings' flesh and her lived reality are, in part, responsible for us understanding the arc and the beauty and the luminous intensity of the documents we have and the contradictions we must live with in order to realize them. So I think Thomas Jefferson.
The framer who towers over all the rest is little James Madison. Someone said of him, never so much a high ratio of mind to mass. And the argument we're having today is whether James Madison of the Princeton class of 1771 can save the Constitution from Woodrow Wilson of the Princeton class of 1879 and the progressive movement. It's an intramural argument at Princeton.